very shortly. We don't want the people following online to miss anything. Okay, we are ready to start. My name's Martin Sandbu. I'm an economics commentator at the FT. I'm delighted to be here to moderate this panel on artificial intelligence and the economy. I'm particularly delighted that AI is not so developed yet that you don't have need for me or a flesh and blood moderator anymore. We don't know how long that's going to take. Thanks all for coming. Thanks to those who have tuned in online to watch this. And thanks to the panelists, whom I will introduce very, very briefly, because there's really no need for much introduction. But of course, Kristalina Georgieva, our host, IMF Managing Director. Thank you for having us. We're in your house. Professor Joe Stiglitz, Nobel laureate in economics. And Deborah Greenfield, Deputy Director General at the International Labour Organization. So 3 wonderful people to have this discussion about AI with. One interesting question about AI is whether it's similar or different from previous waves of automation, because automation is nothing new, technological change is nothing new, and in fact, we sort of know from slightly bitter experience that we haven't always, as policymakers, been all that good at handling previous waves of automation. We've had results like inequality, we've had a political backlash. So one big question I hope we'll address is whether AI is similar or different from those previous waves. One thing we do know is that whereas AI does allow you to automate tasks, the tasks that it allows you to automate are maybe different from those that previous technological waves allowed us to change. So this is sort of the very broad setting of the problem we're trying to face. The subtitle of this panel is Policies for People. And of course, that's exactly what we have to focus on. Once we understand what is facing us, what are the policies we can come up with in order to help the impact be as positive as possible. But in order to find solutions, we first need to diagnose the problem. So I've asked the 3 panelists to give just a few minutes of introductory remarks to sort of set out their view, their perspective on what is actually facing us. So Kristalina, if I can start with you, could you just give us your overarching view and the IMF's view on what the economic impact is likely to be from artificial intelligence and digitization generally?
Since I am the host, welcome to the panelists and of course to the audience here and online. Let me start from your very important question. Is it similar or is it different? Because obviously economists would analyze it with consideration which way we go. Well, it is both. It is similar because it is a big disruption that displaces some jobs, but creates new, gives us a chance to solve possibly previously unsolvable problems, and it is a boost for growth to a certain degree. It is different because of many things, but in particular because of the speed of change. I don't think we have experienced anything moving so rapidly. And that is, why is this an issue? Because policymakers like to take their time to study and then come up with prescriptions. And it is different because it may create a very different set of benefits and losses. And I'm sure Joe will talk about it, who is going to win and who is going to lose. We, at the fund, we tend to be, in our majority, more on the optimistic side, that artificial intelligence is going to create unthought before new opportunities, that it can help developing countries to leapfrog, not only developing countries, it can help leapfrogging in many areas. If we talk about problems, global problems like climate change or cancer. It can help us sort through these problems in a more effective way. It is underpinned by some physical developments, like you do need to have internet connectivity more than for many other things in life. And therefore, it pushes for developing countries to accelerate, to everybody, but especially those that are falling behind. Like you take Africa, only 50% of Africans have access to the internet. And we know that 1% increase of access to internet would give 0.4%, or we research it in that way, would boost growth by 0.4%. So we are more on that more optimistic side, but of course we are very worried about three things. We are worried about, is this going to be yet another factor that increases inequality between countries and within countries? Is it that some would ride high and others would fall off the cliff? Is it going to create a force that might actually undermine our societies by the virtue of spinning out of control? This is Hawkins' argument. This is going to be devastating for the human race. What do we know about this risk? And simply, can we adapt to that in a way that doesn't put us in very uncomfortable position? So I use this example always when I talk about speed of change these days. I told you before we came here, I'm on my way to see my grandchildren. So the story is of my granddaughter. As a good grandmother, I was telling her how when I was her age, there was no TV, no computers. She looks up at me and says, "So you only had iPads." The dramatic change in the way we work, we live, even before artificial intelligence is to spin into changing even faster and even more.
Things are accelerating. Thank you very much. I took that to be a mostly optimistic view, but some very big unknowns. Joe, could you hone in on the developing country perspective for us? I know you gave a presentation on this earlier today, so some people in the audience may have seen that, others will not. But give us the highlights, please, on how this looks from the developing countries.
Great. Before I do that, let me just comment a second as a background about a couple of the ways in which the current round of innovations is different from the past rounds that helps inform why this time may be different for developing countries. The first, the point that Kristalina emphasized, which was the pace is higher. That's really important because people have to adapt, and there are limited the speeds, but not only of policymakers, but of individuals. You go to school, and we don't have lifelong learning, and that means we're fossils by the time we're 40, and if you become fossilized faster, there's a greater loss. The cost of adaptation becomes greater. So speed has all kinds of repercussions, and those become particularly important in developing countries, where they're already facing a problem of catching up. You know, a standard problem of way we articulate the problem with developing countries. It's not just a gap in resources, but a gap in knowledge. But now the frontier of knowledge is moving very fast, and that means the challenge of catching up becomes even worse, and the gap could get actually larger. The second is there's always been a balance between what might be called labor replacing innovation, robots, and rather than AI, I call it IA, intelligence assisting, making us more productive, which increases the demand for labor. So there's some forces for reducing the demand for labor and some forces for increasing the demand for labor at any given set of wages. And in the past, it turned out, particularly for a long period of time, that the demand increasing effects were greater than the demand replacing effects. But there's nothing about economic theory that says that should always be the case. And it appears, at least conceptually, like this new wave of innovation may be more labor replacing, labor saving, to use a term that Hicks used. Why is that important? Well, it's important because the comparative advantage of developing countries is in labor. It could also be resource saving, which is good for the planet, but again, the developing countries have had a comparative advantage in certain types of natural resources, and again, that will affect that will have terms of trade effects that will be adverse. The reason these distribution effects are so important is that when the distribution effects occur within country, we can take the fact that the pie is bigger and reallocate that pie in ways that protect people. But if it's across border, we don't have the tools. There's not a global governance that says, okay, we'll take from the rich countries and give it to the poor. So it's always been the case that particular countries have been adversely affected by particular innovations. And this idea that everything is win-win is sort of a myth that we sell. And it's a good story. And in the past, on average, it's been true. But when you travel around developing countries, you see examples. El Salvador was much richer in an earlier day, and then they discovered chemical dyes that made the demand for indigo to go down. And El Salvador never fully, or took a long time to recover. So, but the problem is the new innovations may hit a broader swath of countries and make the cross-country, for the striking thing for the last 40, 50 years has been the convergence on average of the developing countries to the developed countries. Affected a lot by China and India, but by a lot of other countries as well. And the real risk now is that that will be reversed. And it's partly also caused by the fact that some of these newer technologies are really difficult. It's going to be harder to catch up. They're very, very high skilled. So in the past, you had export-led manufacturing as a mechanism by which developing countries caught up with the advanced countries. Export-led growth is not going to be a successful model. Even if all the jobs in manufacturing that are in China went to Africa, it would only provide employment for a small fraction of the increase in the labor force that is expected in Africa in the next 50 years. So the model of development that has worked is going to have to change. And that's going to be a challenge for the World Bank, for the IMF, for all the institutions that are focused on development. And then the final couple points I want to make is that the new technologies are not only the knowledge is more concentrated in a few countries, the United States and China and Europe to a lesser extent, but within particular firms within those countries. And that means monopoly power is likely to increase. So all of you who've learned about the competitive equilibrium as the basis of economic analysis, you should purge that from your mind. You know, it was an interesting intellectual exercise, but it doesn't describe the 21st century economy. The 21st century economy is characterized by large concentrations of market power in the crucial industries. And that has both efficiency effects and distribution effects. And those are going to be adverse, both of those are going to be adverse to the developing countries. The ranks will go to particular companies in the developed countries. What makes that particularly important is, as a policy issue, is we don't have a global competition authority. So the developing countries, emerging markets, have no real instrument for addressing this problem of lack of global competition. And we all, you know, at IMF and OECD, there have been a lot of discussions in the last couple of years about the unfairness of the multinational corporate tax regime. And that really heightens the importance of that discussion. And unfortunately, where the discussions are right now is not going in a way that is particularly helpful for the developing countries.
That's a crucial point I really want us to get to in conversation, because clearly there's sort of competition for different regulatory approaches across the world now that I hope we'll get to. Before we get to that, if I can just bring in Deborah, because Joe talked about labor-saving technology. And I think there's a good case to be said that a previous wave of automation, the one that sort of put an end to the rise in industrial employment, at least in rich countries in the 70s, 80s, was labor-saving and led to a pretty steep rise in inequality. So one question is, how is AI going to affect workers and different classes of workers? This is something you look at the ILO. So I was hoping you could give us a perspective on that. Is it going to be like some of these bad waves that create inequality and are bad for unskilled workers, or is it different?
Well, Martin, let me start by going back to your original question, are we optimistic or pessimistic? Because at the ILO, what we say is we're neither optimistic or pessimistic. Rather, the question is, can we put in place the policies that will harness technological change, digitalization, in favor of both enterprises and workers? So it's a question about policy as opposed to are we optimistic or pessimistic, which can lead to a kind of techno-determinism, where we wait and see what happens, and then we're playing catch-up. I think we already know some things that are troubling and that lead us to our conviction that this is a question of policy. And let's bear in mind that what differs to some extent about this wave of technological change is its pace, absolutely, and also the fact that we're talking about cognitive skills as opposed to physical labor skills. And in that context, I would mention three potential effects that lead us to focus on policy. One is the effect on employment, which Joe has talked about in terms of developing economies and developed economies. The second one is the distributional effect. That is what happens, what could happen to inequalities without the right kind of policies. And the third, that maybe we haven't talked about so much yet, but I hope we will, is what is the effect on the quality of employment? That is, what is happening to wages, working conditions, as well as social protection. And just to go quickly through those, our research shows that there won't be the same effect in developing and emerging economies as in developed economies. And it has to do with, if you think about call centers, which have moved to developing economies, that's the kind of work that could be replaced and is being replaced by the kind of chatbots we hate to talk to. But there it is. And that has a kind of structural, that's really a macro issue of structural transformations of labor markets On the other hand, we could envision, with the right policies, with the infrastructure that Kristalina mentioned, a very positive effect on agriculture in developing economies, so that agriculture harnesses technological development and uses it to become much more productive, so that, and also so that people within those countries actually can consume the food that they produce. In developed economies, we might see more of a labor augmentation effect. So parts of jobs that accountants, lawyers, doctors do become substituted by, the more routine aspects of their work are substituted by technology, freeing them to do more of what we might call the human-centered work. The next thing we're very concerned about is the inequality implications of AI and the data economy more broadly. Because what we've seen now is widening inequality both between countries and within countries. And so the potential is to layer onto very unequal societies even more inequality. We do see that there are frontier firms that are grabbing the technology and the benefits from technology, leaving small and medium enterprises, leaving those in the informal economy, really left behind. And that has huge implications for inequality and for lack of opportunity. Our recent research shows that when you look at income inequality, the fundamental problem and the root cause is inequality of wages. It's inequality in the labor market. And so we're going to have to tackle this through a whole range of policies if we want to address it. We can look to tax policy, we can look to social protection, but these are really secondary issues if we don't tackle the primary issue of inequality in the labor market. Third, AI is changing the way work is done and the way work is organized, and that has profound implications for the quality of work that we do. I mean, we all love on-time delivery. We all have become dependent on it, but it's workers who are behind that kind of fine-tuned timing. So workers are increasingly monitored by algorithms for their productivity. And when we think about this as consumers, we have to be very concerned about what this does to conditions in the workplace. We have to think about personal monitoring of, we don't want to be monitored with our data, but workers are monitored at the workplace, and that's a huge issue, as well as privacy. And finally, what I would say is, while the platform economy is still only a relatively small part of the economy, what it is showing us is that the traditional employment relationship, which has been the way in which benefits are delivered to workers, whether it's in the form of wages, occupational safety and health, or social protection, that employment relationship is under tremendous strain. And so we can think about the job-creating potential of AI, but we also at the same time have to think about what it's doing to the employment relationship and therefore to the quality of jobs as new jobs emerge. So let me stop there, but I think those are the issues that we're concerned about.
Thanks very much. Before you spoke, I was going to say, well, Kristalina sounds a bit more optimistic, Joe sounds a bit more pessimistic, but of course what you're quite rightly pointing out is that we shouldn't be deterministic, and it all depends on the policy. So let's talk about the policies. Kristalina, some of this stuff like the quality of work is quite new territory for an institution like the IMF. Are you already in a position to give policy advice to countries about how they should optimize the arrival of AI? What are you advising them to do?
So what we are concentrating on are issues that actually came up in this panel. Some things are not very different in terms of we know we have policies and we know how these policies apply, and some are very different. So those that are not very different, obviously having countries to step up in what they do to support agility of their people and businesses. It's not very different. You want to have good institutions. You need to have rule of law. You want to have good education, infrastructure that allows a sort of highly performing economy. They are not very different. Artificial intelligence adds to that a new area of competitive advantage, but the foundation is not very different. They are things that are very different, like ownership of data. I actually can tell you I'm extremely worried that we are talking about this, but we haven't yet figured out what to do to create a fair ownership. This is a new asset that has to be owned in a fair way by those who produce it and those who deploy it. I was quite taken aback by the fact that Amazon is now selling a $59 microwave that feeds data on when I'm eating my popcorn. So that is really new, and we have to figure out what we do about it. There are some people who are saying there has to be a World Data Organization. Knowing the status of affairs in multilateralism today, it is an ideal solution that may be hard to come about. So then what is the second best? That we help countries to have good framework that is done in a way that brings some fairness on that asset. Something that is very different with artificial intelligence is, well, the whole digitalization is taxation. Here the fund has a leg. We do have great people in research on what tax policies we are to be putting in place. We have some very sound recommendations around how you tax the digital business, how you make sure that as you create new type of wealth on the basis of artificial intelligence, you actually have, as Joe was saying, you have thought about your distributional policies in a way that reduces that risk of inequality, taking us to a very, very bad place. And I think we all recognize that we have to do more and do it faster in that area of taxation. And I want to finish with something that is also coming as a big challenge to us. How can we put good economics behind incentives for artificial intelligence to be deployed for things that really, really matter to human race? And that is, again, how we can get artificial intelligence to help us to mitigate the impact of climate change, to reduce our carbon footprint, to help us adapt to a changing climate, give us these solutions, and help us move as a human race to move faster. So at the fund, I think I mean, the reason we are very grateful for having that day, we recognize that this is pressing all of us. We are having our members asking us questions, and we want to work in a kind of a global network manner to accelerate coming up with good advice and good solutions.
Can I follow up with just one thing on ownership and treatment of data? What do you make of data localization requirements when jurisdictions put limits on transferring data out because they don't trust what other jurisdictions might make of it?
Well, this is a logical outcome of the fact that we don't have a good, you called it global competition policy, and that we are really falling a little bit behind the curve of how we deal with data. I think we shouldn't be surprised that this sense of, oh my God, you know, I'm losing control of what is happening from a sovereign standpoint, from an idea of how we protect our citizens. I actually expect that we would see all kinds of things that are not particularly highly desirable because we are not quite able to articulate what is desirable in this very fast moving thing. I would finish by saying I actually do believe there is work that needs to be done around World Data Organization, around coming up with some whether we build it in a network sense and it falls in this category of more and more not multilateral but plurilateral solutions. But we have to step up. We have to lean forward.
This is a bit of an implicit challenge to you, I think, Joe. If we can't have the full-fledged World Data Organization, Global Competition Authority, or until we can have that, given how fast things are developing, we need something else in the meantime.
Yeah, so I think this is a good example that there should be more acceptance of policies like data localization, which need to be thought of as not only privacy, because one of the concerns is that if it's outside your country, some government can take that data, or even some private firm could seize that data. But also there's an issue of industrial policy, which is important for developing countries, that they need to be able to have the scope for developing their data industries. And this may be part of that strategy. I mean, you can debate whether it's an appropriate part, but at least it ought to be within their remit of being able to make a decision about that.
So it's something like cloud services provided, kind of run in a country, for
otherwise, they're going to be left way behind.
Yep.
So it at least has to be on the table. And what has disturbed me is that some of the trade agreements recently have put restrictions on the ability of countries to impose data localization. And that's just one example of the kinds of regulatory environment that are going to be important in governing information.
Yeah.
And so just make one more comment. You know, I think ownership is very important, but the model that says we ought to have the individual control may not be enough. That is to say, I remember having dinner with one of the internet companies who said, you know, he was boasting that for $5 a month, he could get all the data. You know, people would turn over anything. They give you, say, $5 a discount, and I could have all the data and use it to exploit you and get more than that money back from you by targeting them. And he was boasting about how ignorant people were about the value of data. So it's a little bit, we don't allow people to sell themselves into bondage. And it may be that we will have to think about this from a public purpose point of view as well.
Do we even have good research on the monetary value of data? Do we know? I mean, maybe your internet company boss knows, but the IMF, do you know?
Looking at the people on the front rows. Do we have good research on the value of data? We don't yet have it.
So but one way of looking at it is
pledging these people.
We're all catching up here.
Some of the stock market value of these digital companies is a reflection of the belief that they are going to be ahead in data, and it's the capitalized value of the value of that data.
I'm sorry I realize I'm taking a bit of time, but I just want to add one point, because you said privacy and it has to be spoken. we do, on the risk side, create the risk of control over our freedoms that comes with the accumulation of information about us. So I'm driving my Tesla and saying, Tesla, where is the best Indian restaurant? Boom, it comes. And so I'm very happy. And then I thought, wait a minute. She now knows so much, including about my preferences, where I want to go, what do I want to do. What if that information is being used against me? And I think people who are in this, we are all about, we want fintech, we want inclusion, but there is that dimension of what about abuse of access to data, not only to make profits on your back, because, okay, profit, if you make profits, if you figure out a way to tax these profits, so please make them, I'll take it from you and then distribute it fairly. But what if we go into the territory of a use of data in a very destructive societal manner? For full disclosure, I lived under communism for a big part of my life.
So if I may,
absolutely, because this links to the thing
Yes.
about quality of work too. This was sort of the user perspective,
Yes.
but it's the same thing on the worker side.
Well,
no?
we can bring this back to the workplace, and it's not too difficult to imagine that you're, as a worker, you're required to wear monitoring devices that do collect data about you, not just about your performance at work, which then has consequences for your job, but also collects the data just as the car now knows that Kristalina likes Indian food, which may or may not be benign, but one can see how this spreads to the workplace and really degrades the quality of work. On the other hand, I will be an optimist for a minute to say that artificial intelligence, digitalization, does hold tremendous promise for tackling some of the thorniest questions at the workplace and surrounding the workplace. For example, AI has tremendous potential for improving occupational safety and health conditions at work. When we talk about cross-border issues, migrants who have skills in one country but come to another country and have no way of proving their skills, AI can be very helpful. AI can be helpful, digitalization can be helpful in helping people to transfer their social protection accounts, their pension accounts, their health accounts, their work history from one country or one jurisdiction or one job to another. And so we really need to look at the ways in which AI and other forms of technology can actually enhance what's going on in the workplace. And in that sense, I think what Kristalina said about let's use artificial intelligence for humans resonates very much with what we say at the ILO, which is that we're talking about a human-centered agenda for growth and development. One more point is that I think where this all, one of the places in which this comes to a head is when we look at global value chains. And we look at the cross-border issues that are involved. And at the ILO, we're having quite a heated debate about whether it's the cross-border nature of trade that creates issues or whether it's simply a question of national governance and governance gaps at national level. But this is another area where inequality comes to play as artificial intelligence really permeates the global value chain.
Can I just ask you one more question before this, on the global value chains? No. Just one more thing, because you, in your previous remarks, so quality of work, you've talked a lot about, but you also mentioned inequality and employment. What are the sort of policies you see and your colleagues see that can help countries prevent the AI revolution from increasing inequality?
Well, there are.
I want to ask this to
yeah,
you too.
I think I would have to start with national policies that enable structural transformation to higher value activities, but doing so in a way so that there is enough growth to raise income. At the same time, what we need is minimum wage policies. We need to shore up labor institutions, and there are a whole range of them. They start with minimum wage policies, which really provide a floor. We need an environment where freedom of association and collective bargaining are respected and fostered and nurtured so that employers and workers can come up with the solutions that both foster sustainable enterprises, but also make sure that workers are receiving their fair share of the growth in productivity. So those are, I would start there.
Joe, you want to make a point, but I'd also like to hear your answer to that same question, but in quality.
So first, I wanted to make a more general point that one of the ways that AI is changing the economic structure, besides making it more likely that the economy won't be competitive, is that the ability to price discriminate using this kind of information means that, to put it in technical terms, the first welfare theorem no longer applies. The basis of what we talked about in traditional economics that makes the economy efficient, that everybody faces the same prices, and that makes the marginal rates of substitution the same, the marginal rate substitution are equal to the marginal rate transformation. That's being destroyed by the ability to engage in massive price discrimination. And so it makes us rethink about should we have stronger policies stopping that kind of price discrimination? And in response to your last question, is very much similar to the question you asked Kristalina earlier. How does this change the policy framework, say, for the IMF? And one of them is, obviously, it's more important to have policies that protect the labor institutions, the labor bargaining. You have to be more sensitive to the bargaining power of workers. That's gone way down if there's going to be a lot of unemployment. You might say, well, that's just a transition phenomenon, but we'll be going through that for the next 50 years. So you ought to pay attention to that. We've always talked about a trade-off between labor market flexibility and security. I think it puts a little bit more emphasis on thinking about social protection in advance of asking for labor market flexibility, or at least seeing those as a package, because there's going to be a lot more instability. So it changes our you might say priority.
Does that include things like minimum wage
and minimum wage, or there's a debate. I'm very supportive of minimum wage, and that's a reflection. The argument for a minimum wage that Alan Kruger put forward very strongly was that we have labor markets that are not perfectly competitive, and in a world with imperfect competition, minimum wage can actually improve the efficiency of labor markets, and that the traditional models of economists, assuming that the labor market is highly competitive, have been basically discredited, at least by a large part of the labor economics profession. So, and these problems are going to get worse if the pace of change is faster, as you pointed out in the beginning of the discussion.
Kristalina, do you share Joe's worries about the monopolizing tendencies of AI as a technology? And I ask that having in mind your past at the Commission, who are very worried about this.
I'm a bit mid-road on that, and I would explain why. Yes, we see platform companies skyrocketing, and of course they have monopolistic tendencies, and then they price and avoid taxation and do all kinds of things. We see that. At the same time, we also see how technology allows people who would have had no access to capital, no access to networking, to the ecosystem that would make them entrepreneurial, that is also happening. In Africa, there are some 500 incubators where young people come and they create new ideas and new businesses and new opportunities it would have not happened without the internet. It would have not happened without really technology. So it is a bit of a, you have one extreme and then you have also an ecosystem that is fairer. Take Kenya. Kenya has M-Pesa. M-Pesa is putting the brick and mortar banks into the history book. So this is also happening. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what can policy do to shrink the monopolistic tendencies and actually create more fertile ground for that spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship that makes it possible for countries and communities that were behind to not only catch up, but leapfrog in a very dramatic manner. And my call to all of us is to be more open-minded and kind of thinking a little bit outside of the box if we are to come up with good recommendations, because these are new things that it's like driving a car looking at the rear view mirror only, for which our past experience is not very, very relevant. And that's really tough. I'll tell you, for the fund, one of my preoccupations is to actually energize everybody, especially the young people, and get a more of a dynamic environment that would allow us to come up with these kinds of new ideas. They may sound crazy to the old folks like us, but they may be the policy solutions for the future.
Well, we all look forward very eagerly to the IMF's proposals and solutions to make this achievable. And we could go on for hours because we're only just getting warm, but there are some things that AI or any other technology can't do, which is important things like being present for a grandchild's christening.
Yes.
Kristalina has to catch a flight. So
at 6:05, so you have to forgive me. But
end it there, but keep the conversation going. Thank you very much. Join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.